In March of 1981, a 37-year-old woman named Margaret Sullivan stood in the cemetery outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, watching them lower her husband into the ground, and she couldn't make her mind stay on the prayers or the cold air or the sound of dirt hitting the lid, because one number kept coming back like a cough you can't clear. $50,000. $50,000. Tom Sullivan was gone, and that number was still alive, sitting on her chest, heavier than grief because grief didn't come with a due date. Tom had been 41 when a heart attack took him out in the field, and people would say later that he worked himself into the grave. But Margaret didn't need anyone to tell her what stress looks like. She had watched it for months in small ways, the way he held his jaw when the mail came, the way he stared at the kitchen table after supper like the wood grain might turn into an answer, the way he called chest pain indigestion because admitting the truth wouldn't change the fact that the payment was still due. They had 2 kids, Sarah 14 and David 11, and a mortgage-free farmhouse Tom's grandfather built in 1903, and 280 acres that had been in Tom's family since 1889. 3 generations of fences and stones and worn-out corners where the wind always found a way through. That land was the only thing that felt steady, and even that didn't feel safe anymore. Because the debt Tom left behind wasn't some abstract thing. It had paperwork, signatures, and a bank officer who would show up with polite eyes and a hard calendar. Tom's debt came from equipment loans he took out when the world still told farmers that bigger and newer meant safer. In 1978, he bought a John Deere 4440 for $52,000, financing $48,000 over 7 years at 9.5%. And in 1979, he financed a used John Deere 6600 combine for $25,000 over 5 years at 11%. He'd been convinced that modern equipment would let them expand their operation into something substantial, and for a while that belief had the glow of a plan. Before the 4440, Tom farmed with a 1957 Farmwell 450 his father bought used in the early 1960s. And in Tom's mind that old tractor was a reminder of scraping by, of slow days and sore arms. The John Deere felt like moving up in the world. And Margaret remembered the day it arrived like a neighbor's new car. Bright paint, clean lines, the cab smelling like plastic and possibility. Tom climbed up into that seat like he'd earned it. And for a few months, Margaret let herself believe the numbers would work, because belief is easier than doing the math when you're tired and you have kids and you want to think your life is moving forward. But by 1981, the math was turning mean. This wasn't just a recession. It was a collapse working its way through farm country like rot. Interest rates spiked above 20% as the Federal Reserve fought inflation. Commodity prices fell. Hard corn, that had been over $3 a bushel in the mid-1970s, was under $2 and still sliding. Land values that had seemed like they'd rise forever started to drop, and with them went the safety net farmers thought they had. Because collateral only looks strong until the day it doesn't. The boom years of 1973 to 1978 had convinced a lot of families that borrowing was normal, almost responsible. And now those same families were discovering that debt doesn't bend when prices do. Tom hadn't been reckless, not stupid, just timed wrong. And timing can ruin you as cleanly as bad judgment. In 1980, they took a drought that cut yields down to about 85 bushels per acre, and corn prices fell to around $1.10 onto 80 acres. Tom's good year net after operating costs might have been about $25,000, and the equipment payments were roughly $14,500 a year, tight but doable. In 1980, his net income before equipment payments was more like $12,000, and after payments he was underwater. He covered it by not taking a salary and using savings, and he told Margaret it would be fine, that next year would be better, and he said it like a man trying to keep his family from hearing panic in his voice. On March 15, 1981, Tom was dissing a field, prepping for spring planting, when the heart attack hit. He was dead before the 4440 even rolled to a stop, the tractor idling in the middle of the field until Margaret found it 3 hours later, because he didn't come home for dinner. She remembered the sound of that engine running alone in an empty field, and the way the sky looked ordinary, and how it made her angry that the world could stay normal while hers split open. At the hospital they told her there was nothing they could have done. Massive coronary, dead within seconds, small comfort. The first week after the funeral moved like a dream you can't wake from. People brought casseroles, and Margaret nodded and said thank you. And Sarah moved around the house like she was trying not to touch anything. And David went quiet in a way that made Margaret check on him at night, because quiet can be worse than crying. The bank had been sympathetic at the funeral, the way institutions can afford to be sympathetic when there's a crowd watching. But sympathy has a shelf life, and about a week later, it expired. Ronald Gardner came to the farmhouse, the bank officer who had approved Tom's loans, and he walked in with his head in his hands like he wanted to be seen as a decent man. He sat at the kitchen table where Tom used to spread out seed catalogs and repair manuals, and Ronald spoke in a careful voice. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm very sorry for your loss, but we need to discuss your husband's loan obligations. The total outstanding balance is approximately $50,000 to $100. The monthly payment is $1,000 to $110. Those payments need to continue, or we'll need to explore other options." Margaret heard the words like a door shutting. Other options sounded like a phrase people use when they don't want to say repossess in a kitchen where children can hear. She asked anyway, because pretending you don't understand only delays the blow. "What does other options mean?" Ronald shifted and looked down at his hands. "We could repossess the equipment and sell it. If the sale doesn't cover the loan balance, we would need to secure the deficiency against the land. I don't want to do that, Mrs. Sullivan, but the bank has obligations to its depositors." Margaret felt the room narrow. "If you repossess the equipment, how do I farm?" Ronald didn't answer right away because the answer was obvious and ugly. "You probably don't. Most widows in your situation sell the land and move on." Margaret stared at him, and she could see how easy it would be to let the word widow turn into a permission slip to quit. How easy it would be to pack up the kids and go to town and find some small job and tell herself it was practical. But then she pictured Tom's grandfather building this house in 1903, and Tom as a boy running along the fence line, and the way Tom's voice would get steady when he talked about the land. Even when everything else felt shaky, she said it flat, not as a plea but as a fact. "This land has been in Tom's family since 1889. My kids are fourth generation. I'm not selling." Ronald's eyes flickered like he wanted to argue and couldn't. "Then you need to make the payments. Can you do that?" Margaret had no idea if she could, but she understood something in that moment. If she said no out loud, it would become true faster. "I'll find a way," she said. Ronald nodded, stood, and gave her a timeline that felt like a knife wrapped in paper. "You have 6 months to demonstrate you can keep current." After he left, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and opened the farm records, because grief doesn't cancel bills, and the only way out of fear is to name it. Tom had kept records in a neat hand, but even neat handwriting can hide trouble if you don't want to look too hard. Margaret looked, and the situation was worse than she'd admitted to herself. Tom had deferred operating expenses hoping to catch up after a good harvest. They owed $3,400 to the seed company and $2,800 to the fertilizer distributor. There was about $1,200 in the bank. Property taxes were due in September, another $2,600. The equipment payment was $1,000 to $110 a month. The farm needed to be planted in 6 weeks. Margaret hadn't driven a tractor in 15 years, not since the early years of their marriage when she'd still help now and then. And even then she hadn't been the one making decisions. She'd been the extra set of hands. Tom had been the farmer. She'd raised the kids, kept the books, kept the house running. And now the calendar didn't care what she'd done before. The calendar only cared that spring would come whether she was ready or not. She started doing the math in the plainest way, because fancy math doesn't change outcomes. To get through the year she needed to plant, tend, and harvest 280 acres, cover operating costs, make 12 loan payments totaling $14,520, and keep food in the house. She needed to generate at least $35,000 in gross revenue just to break even. At current corn prices, around $1.95 per bushel, she would need an average yield of roughly 127 bushels per acre. The county average was about 105. The numbers didn't just look bad, they looked insulting, like someone had written a trap and expected her to step into it politely. She sat there with a pencil and a yellow pad, and the kitchen clock kept ticking, and the house was too quiet, and she could hear Sarah in her room trying not to cry and David in the living room, watching TV without actually watching it. Margaret realized that the hardest part wasn't the work she might have to do. It was that she had to make decisions while her mind still felt numb. She made herself write down everything: what they owed, what they had, what was due and when, what could be cut and what couldn't. Seed and fertilizer had to be paid if she wanted a crop. Fuel had to be bought. The bank payment had to be made. There wasn't room for mistakes because they were already behind. She stared at the monthly payment number again, $1,210, and tried to picture taking that much money out of the farm every month during a year, when corn couldn't even break $2. It felt like trying to carry water in a bucket with a hole. That was when a knock came at the door, steady and familiar. And for the first time since the funeral, Margaret felt something close to relief, because it wasn't another casserole and it wasn't another person telling her to be strong. It was her neighbor, Walter Henning, 71 years old, a man who had farmed the land adjacent to the Sullivans for 50 years and who had known Tom. Since Tom was a boy, Walter didn't come in with pity. He came in with the plain look of someone who has seen a lot of people lose everything and doesn't have time for speeches. He sat down at the kitchen table, glanced at the papers spread out, and got straight to the point. "Margaret, you can't make those equipment payments." Margaret felt her throat tighten because part of her had been waiting for someone to say it out loud to confirm what the numbers were already saying. "I have to," she said. "If I don't, they'll take everything." Walter shook his head slowly. "If you try to keep that $4,440 and that combine, they'll take everything anyway. Those payments will bleed you dry. You'll struggle for a year, maybe two, and then you'll fail. I've seen it happen a dozen times." Margaret blinked hard because tears felt like wasted time and also because she couldn't stop them. "Then, what do I do?" Walter leaned forward, lowering his voice like the house itself might be listening. "You sell that John Deere equipment. You take whatever you can get for it. Pay down the loan as much as possible, and you negotiate with the bank to restructure what's left at a payment you can actually afford. Then you farm with what Tom had before he bought all that fancy iron." Margaret's mouth went dry. "The Farmel?" Walter nodded. "The 1957 Farmel for $150. It's still in your shed, isn't it?" Margaret hesitated because saying yes felt like admitting she'd go backward. "Yes, but Tom stopped using it when he bought the 4,440. It's been sitting for 3 years. Does it run?" Margaret looked down at her hands. "I don't know. Maybe." Walter stood up like the decision had already been made, like the only question left was whether Margaret would let him help her do it. "Let's go find out." They walked out to the equipment shed, the air smelling like old hay and oil and dust, and there it was under a film of grime. Tires sagging, paint faded, the Farmel for $150 looking abandoned and a little ashamed. Walter walked around it slowly, checking things with the calm of a man who trusts machines more than bankers. "Your father-in-law maintained this tractor beautifully," he said. "Tom did too until he got the John Deere bug. If the engine isn't seized, we can get it running." Margaret stood there and felt two feelings at once, hope and a kind of embarrassment, because hope was coming from something old and plain, when she'd been taught to believe hope came from new purchases and bigger horsepower. Walter didn't care about embarrassment. He cared about whether she kept the farm. And in that moment, with the shed quiet around them and the Farmel sitting like a forgotten tool, Margaret understood that the next few months would decide the rest of their lives. The crop had to go in. The payment had to be made. The bank had given her 6 months, but spring was giving her 6 weeks. She watched Walter reach up and touch the hood of the Farmel like it was a living thing. and she realized she was standing at the edge of a choice that would look insane to everyone who measured success by shiny equipment. She could try to keep Tom's plan alive, keep the John Deere and the combine, and hope the world returned to the way it used to be, or she could cut the plan loose, swallow her pride, and build a new way of surviving out of whatever still worked. She didn't say yes yet, not out loud, but she didn't stop Walter either. And for the first time since Tom died, the number 50,000 stopped being the only thing in her head, because another thought pushed in, quiet but stubborn. If the old tractor turns over, maybe so can we. Walter came back the next morning before the frost had fully burned off the grass, not with sympathy but with tools, and that set the tone for everything that followed, because there wasn't time for feeling sorry anymore. They started with the farmel the way people always start, with old machines, slow and methodical, checking what could still be trusted and what had to be replaced. The battery was dead. The fuel smelled stale. The oil was thick and dark from sitting too long, and the tires sagged like they were tired of holding themselves up. Margaret had expected the tractor to feel like a relic, something delicate and fragile. But as Walter worked his way around it, explaining what he was doing without turning it into a lesson, she began to see it differently. This thing was simple. There weren't wires everywhere, no sealed systems that only a dealer could touch. If something was wrong, you could usually see it, and if you could see it, you could probably fix it. They charged the battery, drained the old fuel, flushed the carburetor, changed the oil, replaced filters, and topped off fluids, and none of it felt heroic, just necessary. The kind of work that had always been done on farms when money was tight, and quitting wasn't an option. On the third day, Walter told Margaret to turn the key. The starter groaned, hesitated, then turned again, and the engine coughed like an old man waking up from a bad sleep. For a moment nothing happened, and Margaret felt her chest tighten, because hope can hurt worse than disappointment when it teases you. Then the engine caught, uneven at first, shaking and loud in the small shed, before settling into a rough idle that smoothed out as it warmed. Margaret stood there listening, and something inside her shifted, not joy exactly, but relief sharp, enough to bring tears to her eyes. This tractor still worked. It was old, it was worn, but it wasn't done yet. Walter shut it down and looked at her carefully, like he didn't want to push her before she was ready. "Here's what I think you should do," he said. "You sell the John Deere and the combine. The market's bad, but you'll get something for them. You pay down as much of the loan as you can, and you negotiate with the bank to refinance whatever's left into a payment you can survive. Then you farm with this farmel. It won't be easy. You'll work longer hours than Tom did. You'll rent some equipment you don't own, but you'll drop your fixed costs so low that the farm can breathe." Again, Margaret asked the question she'd been circling since he walked in the door. "Can I farm to 180 acres with a farmel for 150? Walter didn't answer right away, because lying to someone in trouble only makes it worse later. "It'll be hard," he said finally. "Everything will take longer. You'll feel it in your back and your arms. But yes, it's possible. Farmers did it for decades with equipment like this. The difference is they didn't owe the bank every time they turned the key." That night Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table after the kids went to bed, the house quiet in a way that felt heavier than usual, and she thought about what selling the John Deere would mean. To everyone else, it would look like failure. It would look like going backward, like admitting Tom's plan had been wrong. And part of her resisted that, because loving someone makes you want to protect their choices, even when those choices are what put you in danger. But another part of her, the part that had stared at the numbers and felt the walls closing in, knew that pride didn't pay bills and shiny paint didn't lower interest rates. The bank wasn't asking how hard Tom had worked or what he'd meant to his family. The bank was asking for $1,000 to $110 every month. In the morning, Margaret called Ronald Gardner and told him she wanted to sell the John Deere equipment. There was a pause on the line, and then relief crept into his voice, because this was the outcome he'd been quietly hoping for since the funeral. "That's probably wise, Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "We can arrange an auction quickly." The auction was scheduled for early April, and word spread the way it always does in farm country. Through coffee shops and feed stores and quiet conversations at church, people came from counties away, not because it was a good time to buy, but because there were a lot of auctions like this now, and farmers learned to recognize the sound of trouble even when it isn't their own. The John Deere 4440, the tractor Tom had paid $52,000 for just 3 years earlier, sold for $30,000. The combine brought $27,000. Together they made $61,000 before fees. And when the dust settled and the proceeds were applied to the loans, Margaret still owed $11,800. Ronald restructured it into a 5-year note at 12% interest. The new payment was $260 a month. It wasn't easy, but it didn't feel like a hand around her throat. When Margaret signed the papers, she felt something close to shame, like she was closing a door Tom had worked hard to open. But underneath that was something steadier, a sense that she had traded embarrassment for time. And time was the only thing she didn't have enough of. There was no pause to process the decision, because spring doesn't wait for your feelings. To catch up, Margaret had 6 weeks to plant 180 acres before the window closed. And she didn't own a planter. Tom had always rented one from a neighbor, and Margaret had never set one up herself. Walter showed up again at dawn, not because he had nothing else to do, but because he understood that teaching someone to farm under pressure is about being there when mistakes are most likely. He walked her through hitching implements to the farmer's drawbar, setting the throttle, reading the temperature gauge, listening to the engine to tell when it was working too hard. He showed her how to run the rented planter, how to fill seed boxes without spilling half of it, how to check depth and spacing, how to stop and adjust instead of pushing through and hoping it would be fine. Margaret planted from sunrise to sunset, sometimes past sunset, the farmer's headlights throwing a weak yellow path across the field. The tractor only made about 50 horsepower, roughly a third of what the John Deere had, and she felt every bit of that difference. What Tom could have planted in a week took Margaret 3. Her back ached from the manual steering, her hands cramped, and there were nights she came in so tired she could barely eat before falling into bed. Sarah and David tried to help when they got home from school, bringing water and sandwiches to the field, sitting on the fender and talking about their day because they didn't know what else to do. With their worry, Margaret let them because keeping them close felt safer than sending them away, even though she couldn't let them near the moving parts. By mid-May, the last acres were finally planted. Corn and soybeans in the same rotation Tom had always used, not because Margaret was afraid to change it, but because there was no room for experiments this year. She spent about $8,000 on seed, fertilizer, and fuel, roughly half of what Tom had typically spent, because she cut back on inputs where she could and the farm'll sip fuel. Compared to the big John Deere, when the planting was done, there was a strange quiet, the kind that comes after a long sprint. And Margaret realized that the next test would be patience, not strength. Summer of 1981 was decent, not generous, but it didn't punish her the way the previous year had. Margaret spent June and July cultivating, controlling weeds with a rented cultivator, pulled behind the farm'll. Neighbors watched from a distance, some with admiration, some with pity, and some with a judgment they didn't bother to hide. A few told her outright that she was crazy, that she should sell the land while it was still worth something and move to town, that she was stubborn to the point of foolishness. Margaret listened and nodded and went back to work because arguing doesn't make crops grow. She was too busy keeping the engine from overheating, too busy watching the rows to make sure she wasn't drifting, too busy learning what the tractor could handle and where she needed to back off. In August, Walter Henning's health started to fail in a way that was sudden, only because he hadn't told anyone how bad it was. He'd been battling cancer quietly, and when Margaret noticed he was missing mornings, she assumed he was just tired. He died in September, 2 weeks before harvest was supposed to start. Margaret went to his funeral and cried harder than she had at Tom's, because Walter had saved her in a way that doesn't make headlines, by telling her the truth, when it would have been easier to offer comfort. His son, who lived in Des Moines and had no interest in farming, found Margaret afterward and told her that Walter had talked about her. constantly in his last months. He said you had more grit than most men he'd known. Margaret drove home from the cemetery with that sentence echoing in her head, not as praise, but as a responsibility. Harvest came in October, and this was the moment everything narrowed down to numbers again. Margaret rented a combine from a local operator, paying him a percentage of the crop to cut her acres. The corn averaged 98 bushels per acre, lower than the county average, but respectable given the year and the conservative inputs. The soybeans did better, around 42 bushels per acre. She sold most of the crop in November. Corn was at $1.88 per bushel. Soybeans were at $5.40. When Margaret added it all up, the gross revenue came to about $40,600. After operating costs, equipment rental, and the monthly bank payments she'd been making all year, she netted $9,000 to $100. It wasn't much, and it didn't feel like a victory the way people like to define victories, but it was positive. And in a year when so many farms went under, positive meant alive. She made the November payment. She made the December payment. When winter came and the fields went quiet, Margaret stood in the yard one evening and looked at the farmel sitting in the shed, streaked with dirt and a little more worn than it had been in the spring, and she understood something that would carry her through the next years. She hadn't beaten the system. She hadn't outsmarted the market. She had simply lowered herself enough that the weight on her back didn't crush her. The farm was still there. The kids were still there. The bank hadn't called. And for the first time since Tom died, Margaret allowed herself to think not about how close she was to losing everything, but about how she might get through another year. Because surviving one year had taught her that survival wasn't a single moment. It was a decision you had to make over and over again, every morning, before you turned the key. Winter settled in hard after that first harvest, the kind of winter that makes the house creak and reminds you how old everything really is. And Margaret learned quickly that surviving one year didn't make the next one easier. It only made it possible. By January of 1982, the newspapers were full of auction notices, small boxes of text listing names she recognized, families she'd gone to church with, farms that had seemed permanent when she was younger and now were being broken apart piece by piece. Margaret read those notices at the kitchen table in the early morning before the kids woke up, her coffee going cold, and she felt a strange mix of fear and resolve, because every name she recognized felt like a warning, but also a reminder that she was still standing. Corn prices kept falling, dipping toward $1.65 a bushel, and interest rates stayed punishingly high, the kind of numbers that make lenders nervous and borrowers desperate. Ronald Gardner never called to chat, but every month Margaret mailed in the $260 payment on the restructured note, and each time the check cleared she felt a small, private relief, not happiness, just the absence of panic for another 30 days. That became the rhythm of her life, not seasons anymore, but payments. In early spring she pulled the tarp off the farmel and went through the same routine. Walter had taught her, checking fluids, tightening bolts, listening for sounds that didn't belong, because she understood now that when you rely on old equipment, maintenance isn't optional or occasional, it's constant and personal. If something broke, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat to the entire year. Planting in 1982 was slower than the year before, because Margaret no longer had the adrenaline of crisis pushing her through the long days, and the physical toll settled in deeper, a constant ache in her back and shoulders that never fully went away. She planted knowing the numbers were worse this year, knowing that even a decent crop might barely cover expenses, but she also knew her costs were low enough that she didn't need miracles, just average weather and a machine that kept running. Summer brought more farm sales, more neighbors quietly disappearing, and Margaret noticed how conversations changed, how people stopped asking about expansion and started asking how to get by. She cultivated, she sprayed when she absolutely had to, and she cut corners carefully, not recklessly, always thinking about which dollars mattered and which ones only made her feel like she was keeping up appearances. There was no one left to tell her what to do now, no Walter to lean on, and that loneliness pressed on her in the evenings when the kids were doing homework. and the house fell to quiet again. She missed Tom most in the small decisions, the kind that never seemed important until you had to make them alone, like when to stop for the night or when to push a little longer, when to buy something new and when to make the old thing last one more season. Harvest in 1982 was a test of nerves more than strength. The yields were lower than the year before, the prices worse, and when the final numbers came in, Margaret netted only a few $1,000s, but it was still positive, still enough to make the payments and keep the farm intact. She didn't celebrate, she simply kept going, because by then she understood that farming through a crisis wasn't about winning. It was about not losing. The years blurred together after that, 1983, 1984, 1985, each one carrying its own version of the same pressure. Corn prices bottomed out near $1.65. Land values collapsed, and farms that had sold for $2,000 an acre just a few years earlier were going for under $1,000. Margaret watched families she'd known all her life load furniture onto trailers and leave town, watched banks tighten credit even further, watched the pride drain out of people who had always believed hard work would be enough. Through it all, she kept her costs brutally low. She rented equipment she couldn't afford to own, traded labor with neighbors who were still hanging on, and learned to do nearly all her own repairs on the farm, changing oil, replacing belts, adjusting valves, doing the kind of work Tom used to do without thinking about it. The tractor ran on gasoline and wasn't efficient by modern standards, but it was light and simple. And over the course of a year, she spent maybe $100 on fuel and a few hundred more on parts, installing most of them herself. Compared to what the John Deere had cost, the difference felt almost unreal. There were days when the farm refused to start or a part failed at exactly the wrong moment, and Margaret would sit on the fender, hands greasy, feeling the old fear creep back in, because there was no buffer left. No savings to fall back on if something truly catastrophic happened. But the tractor always went back together, and each repair made her a little more confident, a little more independent, in a way she hadn't expected when this all began. By 1984, the crisis had stripped away any illusion that things would go back to the way they were, and Margaret stopped waiting for improvement and focused instead on endurance. Her gross revenues bounced between $32,000 and $45,000 depending on weather, and prices never impressive, never secure, but because her fixed costs were so low, she always managed to come out just enough ahead. The $260 payment went out every month like clockwork, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance on the loan shrank. Margaret didn't talk about it with anyone because talking about survival feels like tempting fate, but she tracked it in a small notebook, watching the numbers move in the right direction for once. In 1985, as another wave of farm failures hit the county, Margaret realized she was close to the end of something, not the end of struggle, but the end of that particular weight that had been sitting on her chest since Tom died. She had one more year of payments left. She was tired in a way that felt permanent and older than her years, but she was also tougher, more grounded, less impressed by the things that had once seemed essential. Farming had become narrower and clearer, stripped down to its core. Keep costs low, do the work. Don't borrow trouble, and live with the limits you've chosen. When the final year began, Margaret didn't tell the kids what it meant because she didn't want to turn it into something fragile. She planted, cultivated, and harvested the same way she always had, steady and careful. And when the last payment was due in 1986, she drove into town on a clear morning and walked into the bank without ceremony. Ronald Gardner was older now too, grayer, more cautious than he'd been in 1981. And when he pulled her file and looked at the numbers, he shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to tell you something," he said. "When Tom died and I saw your situation, I didn't think you'd last 6 months. I've been in agricultural lending for 23 years, and I've never seen anyone do what you just did. How did you manage it?" Margaret thought about the question for a moment, not because the answer was complicated, but because it felt strange to put into words something that had simply been necessary. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "I had kids to raise and land to keep. So I worked. Ronald leaned back and studied her, then nodded. It's more than that, he said. You had the discipline to cut costs, to farm with old equipment, to live small. Most people can't do that. They'd rather lose a farm than look like they're struggling. Margaret didn't argue with him. She signed the final paperwork, felt the quiet click of something closing behind her, and walked out of the bank without stopping, the air outside feeling lighter in a way she hadn't expected. When she got home, she didn't tell anyone right away. She walked out to the equipment shed and stood in front of the farmel. Older now, more dented, streaked with years of work, and she rested her hand on the hood. Thank you, she said out loud, not sure if she was talking to the tractor, to Tom, to Walter, or to whatever had kept her moving when stopping would have been easier. She went back inside and made supper, because even endings don't excuse you. From feeding your family and life, she had learned, doesn't pause to mark the moments you'll remember forever. Margaret kept farming after the loan was gone, because freedom doesn't come with instructions on what to do next. It just gives you room to breathe, and breathing felt too precious to waste. The crisis didn't end in 1986 the way stories like to pretend things end. Prices stayed low, memories stayed sharp, and the habits she'd built didn't disappear just because the bank no longer had a claim on her future. She planted the same way she always had, careful and conservative, using what she owned and renting what she couldn't justify buying, watching the weather with the same quiet vigilance. She'd learned when everything was on the line. The farmel stayed in service, not because it was romantic or symbolic, but because it worked and because replacing it would mean taking on a risk she no longer needed. Margaret noticed how different her days felt without the weight of debt humming in the background. How decisions stopped feeling like gambles and started feeling like choices again. When a part broke, she fixed it without panic. When prices dipped, she tightened spending without fear. The kids grew older, Sarah leaving for her own life and David finding his way back to the land. And the farm became less about survival and more about continuity, about making sure the next generation had options instead of obligations. In 1998, when Margaret was 54 and David was ready to take over, having gone to college and worked in town before deciding the farm still mattered to him, the transition felt natural, not forced by necessity or loss. David brought modern ideas and eventually some newer, used equipment he paid for carefully. But the farmel stayed, kept as a utility tractor, and a reminder that the farm had once been held together by something older and tougher than horsepower. Years later, David restored it fully, not to show it off, but to honor the seasons it carried them through. And Margaret watched her grandchildren climb on and off it like it was just another part of the place, which was exactly what she wanted. When people asked her later how she'd managed, how she'd paid off $50,000 of equipment debt in 5 of the worst years modern agriculture had seen, she never gave them a speech, because speeches make things sound easier than they are. She would say something simple, usually while doing something else, because she never learned how to stop working just to explain herself. She would say that she sold what she couldn't afford, kept what was paid for, and lived smaller than she wanted to, until the danger passed. If they pressed, she would tell them that debt takes away your ability to wait, and waiting is how you survive bad years. Researchers would later point to data from the 1980s farm crisis and explain that the single greatest predictor of survival wasn't size or sophistication, or even management skill, but debt-to-asset ratio, that farms with ratios below 30% mostly survived while those above 70% mostly failed. And Margaret would listen politely to that explanation because it matched what she had learned the hard way without charts or studies. She understood that selling the John Deere and the combine had looked like a step backward to everyone watching, that people had whispered and judged and assumed she was failing. But she also understood something that mattered more than appearances. Lowering her fixed costs had lowered her fear, and lowering her fear had given her back her life. When she thought about Tom, she didn't blame him, because blaming the dead doesn't change anything, and because she knew how convincing the promises had sounded when prices were high and credit was easy and everyone around you was doing the same thing. She knew he'd wanted to build something solid for their family, and in the end, She believed she had done that, just not in the way either of them had imagined when the John Deere first rolled into the yard. Margaret stayed in the same farmhouse where Tom died and where she raised their kids. And even in her 80s, she could still tell you which fields flooded first and which ones held on in a dry year, still sharp enough to remember the exact feel of the farmer's steering wheel on long days when her arms burned. And quitting would have been easier. When asked what she wanted people to know about her story, she would pause, not because she was searching for the right words, but because she wanted to be honest without sounding bitter. She would say that you can survive almost anything if you're willing to work hard and live small for a while, but you can't survive debt, not in farming, not in life, because debt doesn't care about effort or intention. It only cares about payment. She would say that Tom died from the stress of trying to service loans they couldn't afford, and that she survived by getting rid of those loans and farming with what they already had, and that this wasn't complicated, just hard to accept. In a culture that treats debt as normal and restraint as weakness, the farmer for 150 is still on the Sullivan farm, more than 6 decades old now, still running, still doing light work, still earning its keep in small, quiet ways. The John Deere for 1,440 that once seemed like the future is long gone, likely scrapped years ago after being run hard by someone else who bought it at auction. And Margaret finds a strange comfort in that comparison, not because she dislikes progress, but because it reminds her that endurance and independence matter more than shine. When she looks back on those 5 brutal years between 1981 and 1986, she doesn't describe them as heroic or inspiring. She describes them as necessary. She remembers the sound of the farmall starting on cold mornings, the feel of the pencil in her hand as she tracked expenses, the relief of each cleared check, the weight lifting so slowly she didn't notice. It was gone until one day it was. And if you ask her what she would do again, she doesn't hesitate. She would make the same choice, sell the expensive equipment, take the loss, and keep the farm alive with whatever still worked, because freedom, she learned, doesn't look like success from the outside. It looks like sleeping at night knowing that when you turn the key in the morning, you're working for yourself and your family, not for the bank, and that kind of freedom is quiet, unremarkable, and worth everything.